In a quiet wooden cabin hidden deep within the mountain forests, Ethan and his loyal shepherd Max lived a simple, peaceful life. It seemed nothing could disturb their days, until one cold afternoon, Ethan suddenly collapsed on the porch. Max's desperate, frantic barking alerted the villagers, and they rushed Ethan to the hospital just in time. But fate dealt a cruel blow. Ethan was diagnosed with late-stage stomach cancer and transferred to a major hospital nearly 100 kilometers away. Max was left behind, alone, waiting every evening at the doorway for the man who never came home. This is where our story begins. Stay with me until the end, because what Max does next may bring tears to your eyes. Don't forget to subscribe. And now, let's begin. Dawn pressed lightly over Maple Hollow, a mountain village folded deep between pine-dark ridges and wind-worn cliffs. In this secluded pocket of the world lived Ethan Ward, a 73-year-old veteran whose body bore the quiet scars of past wars and whose spirit carried even deeper, unspoken wounds. Ethan was a tall, angular man with a square jaw softened by time, a trimmed gray beard framing a mouth that rarely smiled. His hair, long enough to brush the collar of his flannel jacket, had turned the color of winter ash. His brown eyes, once sharp enough to read danger before it appeared, had taken on the distant glaze of someone who had outlived too many comrades and too many versions of himself. Years ago, a nighttime ambush in a foreign desert had left him with a lingering limp and an unshakable awareness of mortality. These memories shaped every slow step he took, every careful breath, every quiet hour he spent alone. His only companion in the aging wooden cabin was Max, a 5-year-old German shepherd with a slate-black coat sprinkled lightly with amber streaks around the legs and tail. Max's eyes were warm, deep, and soulful. Eyes that met Ethan's like he understood not just the words, but the weight behind them. Max was large for his breed, with powerful shoulders and a proud stance that softened only when he rested his head on Ethan's knee at night. Unlike Ethan, who had learned to hide his emotions in layers of stoicism, Max carried his heart openly. Loyalty pulsed in every beat of his tail, affection glowed in every brush of his muzzle, and devotion shaped every step he took as he shadowed Ethan around the cabin from dawn to dusk. That morning, the wind drifted through the valley with a crisp bite, rattling the brittle grass outside and whispering through the chimney like an omen. Ethan had woken with a sharp, twisting pain in his abdomen, a pain unlike the dull aches he had known from age or old injuries. He gripped the edge of the kitchen counter, his knuckles white, his breath thin and trembling. Max noticed first. The dog rose from his mat and padded over, nudging Ethan's leg with a soft whine. Max's ears pulled forward, studying Ethan with the instinct of a creature whose world revolved around its master. "Easy, boy," Ethan managed, though his voice cracked with strain. A cold sweat gathered across his temple. For a moment, a surge of fear, raw, unfamiliar, unwelcome, washed through him. He had faced gunfire without flinching, had stood unmoving while chaos erupted around him, but this vulnerability cut deeper. The sense that his body was failing him felt like betrayal. By the time the neighbors arrived, an elderly couple who lived 2 cabins down, the pain had worsened. Mary Ellis, a kind but sharp-tongued woman with silver curls tied in a loose bun, gasped when she saw Ethan hunched over the table. She and her husband, Robert, were simple mountain folk, warm, dependable, worn at the edges by time, but strong in spirit. They were not close to Ethan in the way friends usually were. Rather, they were respectful observers of his solitude, understanding he was a man who kept his circle tight and his heart guarded. But today they stepped into his life with urgent concern. "We're calling an ambulance," Robert said, already dialing. His voice was deep and steady, the voice of a man who had spent a lifetime felling trees and repairing roofs. Ethan tried to object, but the pain choked his words. Max barked sharply, circling Ethan, anxiety rippling through his muscular frame. The siren arrived a short while later, echoing through the small valley like a foreign sound, one Maple Hollow had not heard in many years. The paramedics lifted Ethan onto a stretcher. Every movement drew another low, throaty whine from Max. The dog lunged forward, trying to climb into the ambulance, but a paramedic, a young man with freckles and tired eyes, gently pushed him back. "Sorry, boy, you can't come." Max's ears flattened, his tail lowered, and his body sank toward the cold ground as the doors closed. Ethan's last sight before the ambulance pulled away was Max standing frozen, eyes wide with fear and confusion. Ethan lifted a weak hand toward him, though he doubted the dog could see it. Hours later, after tests and murmured consultations, the verdict struck with the weight of a hammer: stomach cancer. Ethan absorbed the news in silence. The sterile white of the hospital room felt like another battlefield, only this time the enemy was invisible, relentless, and already close. Back in Maple Hollow, Max sat at the edge of the empty path where the ambulance had disappeared. His ears drooped, his gaze fixed on the horizon, his body trembling with a grief he didn't understand but deeply felt. The sunlight faded behind the mountains, leaving the valley draped in blue shadow. The cabin windows remained dark, lifeless, waiting, and Max waited too, unmoving, as if time itself depended on Ethan's return. The chill of early winter settled over Maple Hollow like a thin sheet of glass, fragile and unmoving, sealing the valley in a hush that felt heavier with each passing hour. After Ethan's departure, the wooden cabin at the edge of the pine grove stood lifeless, its porch empty, its windows dim like tired eyes refusing to wake. Max lingered in front of the door from dawn until nightfall, his tall, sturdy frame hunched low as if the weight of absence pressed down on his shoulders. His slate-black coat, usually sleek and luminous, dulled under the constant rushing of cold winds. As the first full day passed, he ignored the bowl of stew Mary Ellis left on the porch. He only lifted his head when the wind stirred, a hopeful flicker, only to fall still again when it carried nothing familiar. Mary watched from the path, worry knitting her brow. The woman, with her silver curls and weathered hands, had raised 3 children and buried 1, and she recognized grief the moment she saw it. Beside her stood her husband Robert, arms crossed over his broad chest, his beard stiff with frost, his expression tight with concern. "He's waiting for him," Mary whispered, as if saying it too loudly would cause Max's fragile hope to shatter. "Dogs know things we don't," Robert murmured, "but I don't know if he understands how far Ethan's gone." That night the temperature dropped sharply. Frost gathered along the fence posts, and the moon hung like a pale lantern over the valley. Max remained outside, sitting near the empty road that cut through the village like a quiet scar. When the clock tower in the village square struck midnight, Max lifted his head toward the sky and let out a low, aching howl. It drifted across the valley floor, carrying a voice that was not anger or fear, but longing. In one of the nearby homes, 70-year-old Harold Chambers, a retired postal worker with thinning white hair and round spectacles perched crookedly on his nose, listened with a sigh. He remembered the howl of wolves from his childhood, but this sound was different. It held heartbreak. Harold stepped onto his porch, clutching a wool blanket around his thin shoulders. He was a gentleman by nature, soft-spoken and patient, shaped by a life spent sorting mail and listening to the quiet confessions of neighbors who lingered at his counter. Hearing Max, he murmured, "Poor thing, he doesn't know." The next morning, children walking to the one-room schoolhouse passed by the cabin. Among them was Lily Marsh, a 9-year-old girl with auburn braids and a round face freckled from summer sunlight. She adored animals, though her timid nature often kept her at a distance from bigger creatures. Today, however, seeing Max curled by the gate with his ears drooped and eyes dimmed, she quietly approached. "Hi, Max," she whispered, placing a small biscuit near his paw. Lily was gentle, carrying a softness molded by her mother's patient teaching and her father's absence. He had left when she was 4, leaving behind a faint bitterness that sometimes clouded her otherwise warm heart. Max barely acknowledged the biscuit. His nose twitched once, but his gaze stayed fixed on the road. Lily frowned. "He'll come back," she said softly, though she wasn't sure if she believed it herself. That afternoon, gossip fluttered around the village like wind-tossed leaves. At the general store, a squat wooden building run by Sam Drayton, a barrel-chested man in his late 50s with a thick mustache and deep-set hazel eyes, the villagers gathered. Sam had lived through harsh winters and lean harvests. His blunt manner came from years of scraping by and his tendency to speak truths others preferred to avoid. "Ethan's not coming back anytime soon," Sam muttered, shelving cans. "He's got a bad diagnosis. That dog better get used to new faces." An old man warming his hands by the stove added, "Dogs don't understand death, but they know when someone's gone for good." Max, lying outside the store entrance, heard none of this, but he sensed the heaviness. Every voice he couldn't decipher added another layer of unease. Each hour that passed without Ethan's scent, footsteps or voice carved deeper into his chest. Pain in animals did not speak in words, but in silence, and Max's silence grew louder than any cry. By the fourth day, snow began to fall. Sharp flakes clung to Max's fur as he sat vigil beside the fence. Mary approached again, her breath clouding in the cold air. "Max, sweetheart, come inside," she pleaded. But Max stood, shook off the snow, and walked past her down the road, only a few steps before stopping again, as if hoping Ethan would appear just over the next hill. The turning point came the following dawn. A small group of elderly villagers gathered beside the path, discussing Ethan's condition. Their voices were low, but the finality in their tone carried in the thin morning air. "He may never come home. The hospital is far, 100 kilometers at least. That poor man. And that dog." Max, lying nearby, lifted his head. The tone, somber, resigned, hit him harder than the words. His ears twitched. His breathing quickened. He stood up, muscles tense, tail hanging low but no longer in defeat. It was a moment of clarity, carved not by logic but by instinct. If the world would not bring Ethan back, then Max would carve a path to him. As the sun spilled across Maple Hollow, turning frost to gold, Max stepped onto the empty road with a quiet resolve. Behind him, the cabin remained still. Ahead stretched a long, winding path leading beyond the valley. And Max began walking. He did not look back once. Snowfall drifted softly over the towering pines as Max left Maple Hollow behind, his paws sinking into the cold earth with each determined step. The road stretched before him in a lonely ribbon, winding between frost-tipped trees and open meadows glazed with white. Though the morning sun shone weakly, the air bit sharply at his nose, carrying the unfamiliar sense of distance and danger. Max's strong frame, normally poised with quiet confidence, now moved with urgency. His thick black and amber coat bristled against the wind, and his breath rose in white plumes as he trotted deeper into the wilderness. He knew nothing of directions or maps, but every instinct within him pulled him forward, as if Ethan's fading scent still lingered in the air like a fragile thread guiding him onward. The first challenge appeared before noon. A dense forest known to locals as Winter Grove, a place where the trees grew so closely together that sunlight barely filtered through. As Max entered, shadows wrapped around him. Branches snapped under his weight, and the earthy scent of decaying leaves clung to his fur. The forest was home to its own silent inhabitants, one of which revealed itself when Max's ears twitched toward a soft rustling. A fox emerged, a slender creature with dark red fur and sharp, intelligent eyes that glimmered like polished embers. Though wary, the fox assessed Max with neutral curiosity rather than malice. This creature, lean from surviving harsh winters, simply watched him pass, its tail flicking once in acknowledgement. Max continued on, his heart pounding as the forest deepened. Hours later, he reached a frozen stream that cut across the path like a jagged scar. Ice cracked beneath his weight, and the frigid water below shimmered with a glassy sheen. Max tested the surface with his paw, and as he attempted to cross, the ice gave way. He plunged halfway into the icy water with a startled yelp. The cold stabbed into him like knives, shocking his limbs. Desperate, he scrambled, claws scraping against slippery edges until he pulled himself out, shivering violently. His thick coat clung to him, heavy with freezing water. With a low whine, he shook himself dry and pushed onward, muscles aching, paws numbing. Each breath became a struggle, yet in his mind echoed a familiar sound, a soft whistle Ethan always used to call him before dinner. The memory ignited warmth inside him, urging him forward through the biting cold. As evening approached, Max wandered into a clearing where the wind cut fiercely across the open land. Snow churned in spirals, stinging his eyes. It was here he encountered another obstacle, a rusted, barbed wire fence stretching across the field. In the fading light, the fence looked like a menacing spine, crooked and unforgiving. Max lowered his body, searching for a gap. Finding none, he leapt, but his hind leg caught the wire. A sharp pain tore through him as the barb sliced into his skin. He tumbled onto the other, sighed with a strangled cry, snow blooming red beneath him. For a moment he lay still, panting heavily. A wave of weakness washed over him. But then, like a lantern flickering back to life, an image surfaced. Ethan, sitting by the fireplace, his thin, weathered hand resting gently on Max's head, eyes soft but tired. The memory steadied Max. Gritting through the pain, he rose and continued limping into the darkening fields. Night descended fully, revealing a sky littered with stars that shimmered coldly. Max found makeshift shelter beneath a fallen log. As he curled into himself, exhaustion tugged at him and his breathing slowed. In the quiet gloom, the sound of distant howls echoed through the forest's edge. Wolves, perhaps 2 or 3, communicated in haunting cadence. Max lifted his head, ears pricked. He recognized the danger. Wolves did not tolerate intruders. Soon, 2 glowing eyes appeared between the trees, belonging to a wolf with a thick gray coat, muscular build, and a scar along its muzzle. The scar suggested a past battle, perhaps with another pack or a desperate fight for survival. This wolf was no stranger to hardship, and its eyes held a brutal wildness tempered by instinct. It growled low, but Max, sensing the warning, stayed still, averting his gaze in a gesture of submission. After a tense moment, the wolf turned away, leading its pack elsewhere into the night. Max exhaled shakily, grateful for the mercy. The next morning, hunger gnawed at his stomach like a dull blade. His paws throbbed, each step pulsing with pain from the barbed wire cut. Yet Max pressed on, following the faint smell of human roads and distant towns. Along the way, he encountered an elderly woman named Alexi Bram, a wanderer who had made her home in an abandoned ranger hut. She was tall and slender, with long silver hair braided down her back and skin weathered by decades of mountain winds. Her sharp cheekbones and piercing ice-blue eyes made her look like a figure carved from winter itself. Tragedy had shaped her. She had lost her son to a climbing accident 15 years ago, and since then had roamed the mountains alone, hardened but perceptive. When she spotted Max staggering near the hut, she approached cautiously. "Easy, boy," she murmured, her voice low but steady, a voice sculpted by solitude. Seeing the gash on his leg, she fetched a strip of cloth torn from an old coat and wrapped the wound with surprising gentleness. Max watched her with gratitude, his tail giving a small, exhausted thump. Alexi studied him closely. "You're looking for someone," she whispered, almost as if she recognized the longing in his eyes. "Go then." With renewed strength, Max continued down the long trail toward the distant lights of towns he had never seen. Pain lingered, hunger clawed at him, and fatigue pressed relentlessly against his bones. Yet every time he faltered, every time he considered resting longer than he should, Ethan's Whistle returned. Soft, warm, unyielding. That memory became his compass, pushing him beyond the limits of ordinary creatures. And so the journey continued, day after day, through forests, fields, cold nights, and open roads, as Max followed the invisible thread tying his heart to Ethan's. The city rose before Max like an overwhelming wall of noise and motion, a place so unlike the quiet forests and frozen meadows he had crossed that for a moment he stood frozen at its edge. Towering buildings cut sharp lines into the gray sky, and long streams of cars flowed like restless rivers, each accompanied by sharp honks that stabbed at his ears. His thick black and amber coat, once full and proud, now hung in clumps from exhaustion and dried blood. His paws were cracked and raw from the relentless journey. Yet even here, amid the chaos, the smoke, the metal, the unfamiliar scents, something inside him tugged forward with steady insistence. Ethan. The faintest memory of his scent drifted on a breeze rolling down the street, so fragile it might have been imagined. But Max felt it, and he followed. He advanced through the city with unsteady steps, weaving between crowds of people who stopped, startled by the sight of the wounded shepherd. Some backed away, others whispered, and a few reached out instinctively before pulling back, unsure. One of these was a middle-aged woman named Gloria Finch, a nurse walking home after a night shift. Gloria was short and round-shouldered with wavy brown hair falling across her tired eyes. Her face held the softness of someone who spent most of her life caring for others, but today exhaustion carved heavy shadows beneath her lashes. When she noticed Max limping past, her instinct flared. "Sweetheart, where's your owner?" she murmured, kneeling slightly. But Max barely reacted. His breath was shallow, his mind fixed ahead. Gloria rose slowly, watching him go with a crease of worry forming between her brows. She had seen suffering in many forms, but something about the dog's unwavering determination stirred her deeply. Max crossed intersections, dodged bicycles, and squeezed between bodies pressed along the sidewalks. The city's sharp smells, hot fuel, fried food, wet concrete, clung to his nose, disorienting him. At one point he stumbled into an alley where a homeless man named Decker Malone sat wrapped in a tattered green coat. Decker was a gaunt man with a narrow, angular face covered in a coarse, dark beard. His eyes, a muddy hazel, were both guarded and sorrowful, shaped by years of loss and disappointment. Once a factory worker with a family, he had spiraled after an accident cost him his job and left him with a permanent limp. Life's harsh turns had worn down his spirit, but traces of compassion still flickered beneath the grime. When Max limped toward him, Decker instinctively reached out. "Easy, boy," he whispered. Max paused only long enough for Decker to see the deep cut along his leg and the tremble in his limbs. "You're hurt, bad," Decker murmured, but before he could do more, Max pushed on. Decker watched him go with a hollow ache in his chest. "Whatever you're looking for, I hope you find it," he breathed. By late afternoon, Max had begun to falter. His breaths came ragged and thin, each inhale pulling painfully at his ribs. Hunger gnawed at him until even the thought of food faded behind a haze of exhaustion. His vision blurred, city lights smearing into streaks of color. And then, finally, he saw the hospital. It loomed ahead in pale stone and glass, a fortress of hope and fear. As Max drew closer, his legs wobbled, nearly giving out beneath him. But just before the final collapse, his nose caught the unmistakable scent he had chased across forests, rivers, fields, snow, and now asphalt. Ethan. The hospital's security guard, Marcus Hale, stood at the entrance with arms crossed over his broad chest. Marcus was a large man in his 40s, with a clean-shaven head and a trimmed black beard. His square jaw and stern brown eyes often intimidated visitors, but those who knew him understood he was gentle at heart. The hardship of losing his younger sister to illness years ago had softened him beneath the uniform, and he carried a quiet compassion for the vulnerable. When he spotted Max staggering toward the gate, Marcus straightened. "Hey, easy there," he started, taking a step forward. But Max collapsed before he reached him, hitting the pavement with a dull thud. Marcus rushed over, kneeling beside the shepherd. He noticed the wounds, the filthy fur, the trembling breath. And then, something glinted beneath the tangled hair round Max's neck, a small metal tag. When Marcus turned it over, he froze. Inside a plastic pouch behind the tag was a tiny, folded photograph. The image showed Ethan, frail, elderly, smiling faintly, resting his hand on Max's head. Marcus exhaled sharply. He recognized the patient. Ethan Ward had been admitted days prior. "You've got to be kidding me," Marcus whispered. Without hesitation, he spoke into his radio. "I need medical staff at the entrance, now, and someone notify Ward in room 314. Word spread quickly through the hospital corridors. Nurses peeked out from behind stations, doctors whispered, and patients turned their heads as the story rushed from mouth to mouth. A dog walked almost 100 kilometers to find his owner. Even those accustomed to emergencies felt their hearts shift. Ethan, pale and frail in his hospital bed, was being prepared for a pain management evaluation when a young nurse named Calvin Ortiz entered. Calvin was tall and thin, with short curly hair and a gentle demeanor that soothed even the most anxious patients. His soft voice carried by nature rather than effort. "Mr. Ward," he said carefully, "there's someone here to see you." Ethan's eyes widened with disbelief. His heartbeat quickened. "Max?" he breathed. "Is it Max?" Minutes later, Ethan was wheeled down to the hospital courtyard. The cold air struck him sharply, but he barely felt it. Max lay on a blanket, half-conscious, chest rising and falling in weak motion. When Ethan's wheelchair came into view, Max's ears, twitched. His eyes fluttered open, and when he saw Ethan, something inside him ignited, weak but fierce. With trembling legs, he pushed himself upright. The movement drew gasps from the small crowd gathering around. Max wobbled forward, collapsing and rising again, inch by inch, until his head reached Ethan's trembling hand. Ethan's voice cracked as he whispered, "You found me, boy. You really found me." Doctors and nurses stood silent, breath caught in their throats, witnessing not a medical emergency but a miracle carved from love and devotion. And as Max pressed his head against Ethan's palm, the courtyard fell into a hush so profound it felt like the world itself paused to honor them. The morning after Max collapsed into Ethan's arms, the hospital courtyard remained unusually still, as if the walls themselves remembered what had happened beneath their windows. In a small recovery room on the 3rd floor, Max lay curled on a thick blanket, an IV line taped gently to his foreleg. His chest rose slowly, the rhythm stronger than the night before. At his side, seated in a reclining chair, Ethan Ward watched him with trembling emotion. Ethan looked weaker than ever. Sunken cheeks, pale skin stretched thin over his sharp jawline, silver hair lying flat against the pillow behind him. But in his eyes, dark and weathered by a lifetime of battles, something bright flickered back to life. Hope. Outside the room, the world had changed. A receptionist named Jenna Murphy, a young woman with vibrant red hair and pale freckles, scrolled through her phone during a break. Jenna was energetic, talkative, and often overwhelmed by emotion. She cried during sad commercials and laughed too loudly at stand-up comedy. When she watched the video security footage that had been quietly uploaded online, a wounded shepherd dragging himself across the courtyard toward a frail old man. Her hands flew to her mouth. "Oh my God," she whispered. "People need to see this." Without hesitation, she reposted it with a caption. "Love always finds the way home." Within an hour, Jenna's post had been shared thousands of times. By noon, reporters began calling the hospital. One of the first to arrive was Hank Grayson, a seasoned news correspondent in his late 50s. Hank had a blocky frame, graying beard, and a trench coat that had seen too many winters. His deep-set blue eyes revealed the weariness of a man who had covered too many tragedies. Fires, accidents, wars, but beneath that exhaustion lived a persistent curiosity. He had built his career on finding stories that mattered, stories that stirred people awake. When Hank heard about Max's journey, he didn't hesitate. "This," he muttered to his cameraman as he walked through the automatic doors, "is the story this country needs." Upstairs, Ethan was being interviewed by Calvin Ortiz, the gentle nurse who had guided him to the courtyard the previous day. Calvin checked Ethan's vitals, adjusting the thin hospital blanket draped over his legs. "You've gone viral," Calvin said softly, almost amused. "Millions of people are watching your story." Ethan blinked, bewildered. Fame had never been part of his quiet life. "Our story," he corrected weakly, nodding to Max. His voice cracked, but the bond between man and dog filled the room like a silent anthem. Downstairs in the lobby, another crowd was forming. Among them was a woman named Teresa Holloway, a teacher with short silver hair, soft brown eyes, and a kind smile that hinted at decades of nurturing children. She held a bouquet of white chrysanthemums, flowers that symbolized loyalty. Teresa had lost her husband, the previous year, a grief that carved quiet hollows in her heart. When she watched Max's video, something inside her cracked open. "I needed to see this," she whispered to the volunteer at the desk. "It reminds me that love comes back. Somehow." The volunteer guided her upstairs, where she placed the flowers outside Ethan's room with a handwritten note. "Your bond gave the whole country strength today." By evening, the hospital was buzzing like a hive. Doctors, nurses, and patients whispered through hallways. A young boy in a wheelchair asked his mother if he could go see the brave dog, while elderly patients nodded knowingly, recognizing devotion in a form purer than humans often managed. Even Marcus Hale, the stern guard who first found Max, felt a lump rise in his throat each time someone mentioned the shepherd. He kept returning to check on Max's condition, lingering in the doorway with his arms crossed, pretending it was just routine. But every glance betrayed his relief. The story reached national news networks that night. Hank Grayson stood on the sidewalk outside the hospital, his breath frosting in the cold air. He spoke into the camera with a voice steadier than usual, because even for a hardened reporter, this story carried warmth. "A dog named Max," he said, "traveled nearly 100 kilometers through forests, storms, and traffic to reunite with his ailing owner. Their meeting has touched millions. At a time when the world feels divided, their devotion reminds us that loyalty still exists, quiet, unwavering, and willing to cross any distance." Inside the recovery room, Ethan gently stroked Max's head. The dog opened his eyes slowly, pupils warm with recognition. Ethan smiled, a small, fragile smile that softened his entire face. "Look at you," he whispered. "You made it farther than I ever could." The bond between them filled the room with a glow no machine could measure. Nurses paused in the doorway just to witness it. Doctors stepped quietly, unwilling to disturb the miracle still unfolding. In the days that followed, donations poured in for Max's care. Letters arrived from across the country, handwritten notes from veterans, children, grandparents, people who had loved and loved again. Television hosts spoke of Max as America's dog, and social media crowned him a symbol of devotion. Even politicians quoted the story, calling it a reminder of the loyalty citizens deserved from each other. Max recovered slowly under the hospital's supervision. His leg healed, his strength returned, and his coat began to regain its dark sheen. Ethan, too, found a renewed will to fight his illness. Each day he seemed a little stronger, as if Max's presence lit a fire inside him that medicine alone could not spark. And soon, a single sentence echoed across talk shows, news articles, dinner tables, and classrooms across the country. If there is anything on this earth that never abandons you, it is the love of a dog. In the end, Max and Ethan's journey reminds us that miracles are not always loud or wrapped in thunder. Sometimes they come on tired paws, across frozen miles, carried by a love that refuses to break. Some people call it instinct, others call it loyalty, but those who have walked through hardship know the truth. When love endures beyond reason, something greater is at work, something unseen, something divine. Perhaps God Himself places these small, shining threads of grace in our lives to remind us that we are never truly alone, even in our darkest moments. As you return to your own busy days and everyday burdens, may this story gently remind you to look for the quiet miracles around you, the devotion of a friend, the kindness of a stranger, the strength you didn't know you still had. And may God bless you, protect your home, and watch over the loved ones who walk beside you in this life and beyond. If this story touched your heart, I invite you to share it with someone who needs hope today. Leave your thoughts in the comments below and subscribe to the channel so we can continue bringing you stories of faith, courage, and the everyday miracles that God places on our path. May His grace follow you wherever you go,